In 2015, Doug Porpora, Professor of Sociology at Drexel College, wrote Reconstructing Sociology, a Critical Realist Approach. The book served as both an introduction to critical realism and a challenge to the status quo of contemporary sociology. Beginning with the myths of American sociology, it proceeded to ask big philosophical questions about sociology. What happened to social structures? What is truth? How do we understand culture? And what are persons? It is in this context that Doug makes a rather deliberately provocative assertion that sociology needs to revindicate the Cartesian cogito. Now, for the past few years, I've been having an often on-again conversation with Doug about this claim and about related issues of personhood, of the agent, of agency, of human nature, the unconscious, social structures, habitus practice, and post-structuralism. Now, all of these terms have always been contentious and controversial terms, both in philosophy, in social theory, and in critical realism. So I thought we might sit down and try to work through some of these issues. Doug, I need you to defend your claim.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for that intro and the question. So, as you know, I think of myself as a provocateur. And who was I provoking here? Well, I was provoking, in part, the post-structuralists who always focus on the Cartesian cogito. And it's not so much the Cartesian cogito that I'm trying to defend as the self understood as a center of consciousness. And what I mean by that is, do I think that the self remains constant? And actually, I prefer, instead of talking about the self, which suggests some kind of interior ghost in the machine, personhood. So we are embodied persons, and as embodied persons, we're the same person today as we are tomorrow and as we were yesterday, which means that we have to take responsibility for what we did yesterday. We can't say, well, that was somebody else. It's who we were. So there's certainly discontinuity in our self. I would say persons are self. So there's discontinuity in our selfhood. There's also incoherence of varying degrees. But there's still a centered subject of consciousness that feels. If it's just subject positions, for example, then what is it we care about? I think one other way, let me just say, of putting this is, as you asked me recently, I'm a Buber guy. Yeah, so I really, at least the title of Buber's book, I and Thou, I'm really into, that I think there has to be some kind of thou there to care about. And whether we're talking about transgendered people, women, racial minorities, the oppressed working class, for us to care, they have to be somehow beings that feel and suffer and respond. So that's really what I'm defending, is some sense of enduring selfhood that feels and experiences.
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot in that I don't have so much of an issue with, but this question of centeredness, or the sort of center of the person, of the agent, of the self. Do you want to, why does it need to be centered, or what's the sort of nature of that center?
So the nature of the center is the I that I'm addressing. So I would say, who just asked me that question? I would say whoever it is that asked me that question, that's what I mean by a center. So I would say there are multiple yous in there, that and one of them in particular is asking me this question, or it's a unified self that's just asked me this question as a unified self. So some things we do, just like think in terms of a nation. You could say, well, who is America? Well, America acts and invades Iraq. You could say, who invaded Iraq? Well, America as a whole invaded Iraq. And so there's certain things we do as a whole.
So, again, this is sort of one of the things I find really interesting in terms of, so we can talk about America as a whole, but is it a whole, or is that wholeness actually a linguistic construction? Is it just a nominal form that we don't quite know what to do with it? It's this conglomeration of all sorts of factors. It's heterogeneous. It's changing to certain degrees. I mean, why do you think we need to take it as a whole in that sort of way?
So it sounds to me like you're asking a question. Well, you used the term nominalism.
Yeah.
So is it a heuristic that we speak of the United States as a holistic object, or is it an ontological reality? So my inclination is always to say, if it's useful epistemically in terms of how we make sense of the world, to think of some object as a whole, then prima facie, at least, it makes sense to understand it ontologically that way. So it's the United States is really, I mean, as you know right now, the United States is extremely polarized. And I don't see, when I say the United States there is something that's a whole that's polarized. I couldn't even say that we're polarized, for example, if there weren't a whole that had these poles. So we're not two countries, although we live in almost two worlds at this point, Fox News world and MSNBC world, maybe, and CNN world. I think insofar as the U.S. acts as a unit in some ways, and both internally and externally, I would be disposed to say ontologically it is a whole, and it's not just a heuristic.
So, I mean, and this is one thing I've been thinking about for a while when we talk about ontology in the social world, or when we want to talk about reality, the reality of the social world, just how we sort of conceptualize that, because it seems, or at least the case could be mounted, that there are lots of different realities, that there are different sort of aspects of the real that, I mean, Roy Bhaskar used to be fond of saying that illusions are real.
Illusions?
Illusions, yes. So in terms of trying to unpack this aspect of, I suppose, definition of ontology, how do we understand the sort of, or how do you think we understand, or how do you understand this sort of question of ontology in the social world and of realism?
Okay, I think I'm going to step back and give
Sure.
a simpler answer, and then you asked me kind of a complicated question.
Yeah, it was kind of a complicated question.
Well, it was complicated, a difficult question.
Yeah.
So how do I understand the ontology of the social world? That I can answer pretty simply. So I think that my understanding of critical realism is that it's anti-reductionist. And it's anti-reductionist in a number of ways. Certainly it's anti-reductionist in terms of reducing society just to individuals, so it's not methodological individualist. I think it's anti-reductionist in not reducing persons to physiology, although I think obviously things have to be going on in our brains for us to act as we do. But I think it's ontologically anti-reductionist. There's moves in the social sciences and the humanities to collapse ontology. So you have like relational sociology that wants to say there's no substances, there's just relations. Well, that strikes me as a bit crazy. I mean, that there have to be some kind of, relations have to have some kind of relata that they connect. On the other hand, rational choice theory tends to deny the reality of relations. That seems to me equally untenable. Mm-hmm. So in my ontology, there would be relations, social relations. There's culture, which are intersubjective or shared meanings, that require interpretation, hermeneutics. And there are actors, so I would also be opposed to attempts to do away with the actor, like in practice theory. That seems to almost be behavioristic. So I would say there's agents, there's relations, there's meaning. Would be the basic.
Sure.
And I'd probably be open to other things. There's institutions.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of prone to say that there's multiple kinds of things in the social world. Now you asked me this question, like Roy says illusions are real, and on the face of that sounds crazy, but I actually agree with him. I mean, if you mean, well, are people's ideas real? Is it real that I believe in critical realism? Well, I think that that's a real state of mind. It's a real idea I hold, and if I'm deluded about it or mistaken about it, that mistake is a certain reality to that mistake. So I guess my view of realism is, so actually I would go back to kind of Quine and notions of ontological commitment.
Oh, interesting.
So I would say, I'm ontologically committed to what the best theories seem to invoke.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, just in terms of these sort of multiple aspects of the relations and language and agents, I mean, one of the sort of questions this has raised about agents, certainly for me as well, is let's take habitus. I mean, habitus is just is just one of those issues that sort of splits a lot of critical realists.
Yeah.
Because, as Maggie sort of talks about, this sort of tendency to a central conflation, where you have where both structure and agency is sort of reduced into this one moment, which is a mishmash of all these different factors. Now, I'm partial to that in that I kind of think that maybe it's the sort of just the nature of this particular social phenomena as the intersection of different forces, that there is a sort of necessary fusion that takes place. And for me, this is sort of one of the angles in terms of the agent and the sort of decentering of the center, where is it the agent acting? Is it the habitus acting? Is it the habitus acting through the agent acting through the habitus? Or just to be provocative, this is legitimate in terms of trying to think through and work through this issue.
It makes. I have a question for you after this.
Good.
So you're right. The notion of habitus divides the critical realists. Certainly, Maggie Archer is most hostile to it. I may be
one way of.
I may be second most. I've softened on Bourdieu to the extent that I think that his notion of field, what he's talking about, is a little bit restrictive in how he talks about it, but he just basically talks about relations among social positions, and that would be the kind of, that's for him is structure, and that would be structure for me as well. Mm-hmm. Human relations among social positions. The habitus, there's actually two objections that we tend to have. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm remembering the line from Distinction, maybe elsewhere, the habitus is structuring structure.
Yeah.
That's really a nice line. I don't know what he means when he says structure. Is anything that structures a structure? So my moral commitments structure my life. Is what I call that my moral commitments a structure. I don't think that's helpful, actually, and that would relate to Maggie's distinction between the central conflation. That it seems to me, look, I'm situated in a social structure, a capitalist social structure, a university structure, and these things constrain me in terms of the relations that I'm in, and that's a different ontological thing than my moral commitments, although both might structure my behavior. So one objection to that is that things are combined that would be helpful to keep separate. Although, having said that, I am somewhat sympathetic to what you talk about fusion. I mean, so I think in reality, these things get fused. That's fine. But I think analytically, we can separate out different components of this. And whether it makes sense to do that or not really depends on what we're analyzing and what's at stake. The other problem with habitus is that, so do I think that, I know this is one thing you're going to ask me, there are unconscious processes that operate on within us? Sure. I think that there's a tendency, I don't know whether, Maggie would say it's in Bourdieu, I think it's in the Bourdieusians, a lot of American Bourdieusians in particular, to say, yeah, everything is habitus, you know, that, and I think that they have a very a mistakenly phenomenological conception of what's conscious. So if you look at the phenomenologists of what's conscious, it's like the moments when you're sitting behind a chessboard and you say, should I move there, should I move there? And you have a plan and you act on the plan and it's all articulated, and that's what consciousness is. Yeah. But you know, I'm talking to you right now, I'm not planning out what I'm saying, I'm just sort of coming out, and I think I'm conscious as I'm doing this. So I would object to the way, one of the things, as you know, I've argued that sociologists in particular are not good at. They're not good at conceptual clarity. And I take kind of an ordinary language view of things, which means how do we talk about consciousness? And I would say right now we would say that our discussion that we're having is a paradigm of conscious behavior. And it doesn't seem to involve plans and fully pre-rehearsals of what we're going to do. So it's not that I object to the notion of habitus as much as the imperialism of habitus in the academy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with everything that you said there. I think one of the sort of key things that takes place is that sort of bifurcation into the routinized moments and then the sort of spontaneous conscious moments where, you know, right now we're conscious because we're talking, but if we weren't talking, if we were just going about, there's that unconscious just going through the motions almost sort of aspect to the way in which habitus is theorized, which I think is useless.
Yeah,
and I think it's stupid, actually.
I think that's exactly what I object to.
Yeah.
Are there levels of awareness? Yeah.
Yeah.
And attention? Yes.
So I mean, I think this then again this sort of gets to that other side of it, which, you know, you rightly said I'm going to ask you about the unconscious and how you think about the unconscious, and then, you know, then I'll tell you what I think about that.
Okay. Again, Maggie Archer is the most resistant among us to the unconscious, and I don't know if I'm second, but I'm certainly have been resistant. And one question I'll ask you, I'm going to finish answering your question,
Sure.
was why are you so into the unconscious?
Yeah.
What's the appeal of the unconscious? So I would say, are there, so I guess you said, wasn't aware of this, that Maggie prefers talking about levels of awareness. I'm more comfortable with that too. What I'm opposed to is not positing unconscious motives. I think there are unconscious motives and unconscious ideas. I think I say in the book that I've hung around with object relations psychoanalysts enough to see the power of misidentifying the object of your emotions and thinking it's one thing when it's really something else. So being mistaken about what you're thinking, I certainly think that happens. So I don't have a problem allowing entrance of unconsciousness. Where I object is where, again, I think, so one of the things I want to write, actually, and I think I've mentioned this, is a defense of folk psychology. And I think that unconsciousness, the appeal to unconsciousness is sometimes deployed to eclipse folk psychology. And I think folk psychology, along with positivism, is a specter that haunts the social sciences because in folk psychology, and folk psychology is really just the theory of action built into our natural language, where we do what we do because of our emotions, our wants, our beliefs, and our intentions. It's a pretty good theory, and I think it has to be a good theory if you think that humans are cooperative animals who survive by coordinating their actions with each other. And we couldn't possibly coordinate our actions with each other unless we could reliably guarantee that we're going to be at this moment here being interviewed, months ahead of time. If I were just so ruled by unconscious motives that I couldn't make those kinds of guarantees, I see that as problematic. So I suppose my answer is I'm fine with unconsciousness as long as it doesn't become too imperialistic and evades the kind of basic psychology of the folk that I think is really you can't get away with that and still make sense of how we coordinate our behaviors with each other.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of that. I mean, I agree with you on a lot of that. So what I see in the unconscious is a few things. And I think part of the problem whenever the unconscious comes up is this question, what do we mean by the unconscious? And certainly in Freud and Lacan and a few others, and these object relations sort of psychoanalysts, there are sort of different aspects to it. So, the baseline, there's the bodily aspect. That's the sheer itness of the human being, the sort of animal aspect to it, the various drives and hormonal drives and biological urges or whatever we want to call it that are caught up with that, and which we're not always conscious of or aware of, that do drive us towards certain actions, not completely and deterministically. There is sort of conscious self-reflection which can sort of restrain. I mean, this is what Freud is interested in. So there's that animalistic aspect of it. So that's the first aspect. The second, let's take the object relations sort of psychoanalysts. That our experiences in childhood or as we sort of mature, we develop these associations and attachments and connotations to particular objects. For whatever reason, we form those. They're born out of trauma, or they're born out of love, or whatever it may be, and that these associations stay with us, and that we are not always aware of them, and that our action, I suppose one way of thinking it is elicited in response to those objects when they appear. We have emotional reactions, or we have physical reactions, or there are certain compulsions to do particular things. So I think that's another important aspect. The final, and I think perhaps the most interesting, is Lacan's definition of the unconscious as being structured like a language, which means, I think, a lot of different things. But just to seize on two, the first is building on the sort of Saussurean structuralist, post-structuralist aspect, that language is constituted by relations and relations of relations, and has that sort of decentered quality to it, where you begin with one term. How do you understand cat? Well, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, it's kind of this, it's kind of not this. It has, it has fur, and so it sort of builds up in that sort of web. And Lacan very much sees the unconscious in that sort of way, in a very sort of post-structuralist way, where the sort of centered aspect of the being is sort of diffused throughout these networks. So you have the relationality that he brings to the language of the unconscious, whereas Freud is, in many respects, a sort of very stratified notion of the unconscious, where you have the ego, the superego, and then the it. So you have those elements, and then I think the sort of characteristic aspect in Lacan is the way in which, in many respects, we respond to the world through language, and that the language systems that we inherit inherently structure the way in which we go about the world, in understanding objects, in relating to objects. So in some respects, Lacan brings these two aspects together. And the reason I find that important is because, and I'm sure, you may disagree with this, but that folk psychology, there are certain things it can't explain. Why people are compelled to do particular actions, why people do things that otherwise we can't explain by appeals to conscious motives. And so it has a very a very strong explanatory power to unpacking certain activities. I mean, in some respects, it's similar to the role that habitus could play if people would theorize it correctly, according to how I want to define habitus, the sort of weight of experience that the agent is in a constant engagement with, that they're drawing upon, that they're reconstituting in different ways, and the way in which that weight of experience and the weight of the past weighs upon the present like a nightmare, to bring Marx into the equation. And understanding, I think, social action through that lens, it's a sort of decentered lens along a few different lines, along the sort of bodily lines, along the linguistic lines, along the sort of relational lines. And then then we have this, maybe we could call it a decentered center at best, that we sort of operate at this site between these different elements. I don't know if you agree or like that, or
this may surprise you. I like it more than you think I would like it. I have some reservations about it that you might accept. Mm-hmm. Going back to the start of what you were saying, mm-hmm. What you said is kind of helpful to me. I never really fully understood what Lacan meant by the unconscious is structured by language, because I thought, well, isn't all thought structured by language? Not just the unconscious, but even, we're affected by our linguistic thoughts. I actually like Saussure, mm-hmm. And I think in Saussurean terms. I don't take it in a post-structuralist sense, but I think that, when I teach close reading, which I try to do with my students, mm-hmm. I immediately go to Saussure and paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations and try to show how different things are different. And I think it's right that when I think of how my mind wanders, mm-hmm. It wanders along these paths that are kind of linguistic. And I once, I don't know if you are aware of this, I once did what I called ethnography of the mind, where I tried to do a very self-ethnography and see, well, who am I talking to when I talk to myself, and where am I not using language? And it's really hard to find a moment when you're not using language, because as soon as you see it, your language colonizes it. There are moments when you're very immersed and you're not necessarily using language. So what you said about Lacan, that was helpful. I really liked what you said about habitus. Your understanding about habitus, I like most of what you said about habitus. If habitus were described the way you described it, where there is a self there that's interacting, that the self has a baggage. So, I mean that's all part of the self. The weight, my experiences and the weight of my experiences, which you call the nightmare, they're not all nightmarish. Some are positive.
And they come through in sort of structured ways. Just
sure.
Because we socialized in
I think that's
ways.
All. I agree with that. You say it's decentered, and what I want to push back on you is you like decentered. You like decentered. And I want to push back on you also. You like assemblages more than I like mechanisms. I would say, well, there's both probably. But wait, let's finish this thought before we go there. So it goes back to the very first question. So your account of habit, the way you described it, goes back to the very first question. Well, one of the first questions we began about the U.S. and why do I see it as a whole. Mm-hmm. In some sense, it may be a decentered. There's this decentered weight of experience or habitus that the subject, am constantly rallying to do something with my whole being. I mean, it's my whole being that picks up this cup, or that talks to you, or that moves from here over to there. How I do it may have all these kinds of conscious and unconscious elements, but at the end of the day, I'm acting as a unit, just bodily. My body follows wherever my mind tells it to go. And so I have to act as a unified whole that I'm rallying. So if you want to say that there's a whole that ever emerges in different ways, that draws on this decentered background, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll
Sure.
So I think that you're right that there are things like compulsions that folk psychology just isn't equipped to answer. But I think the mistake, and I'm not saying you're making it, but that's made with a lot of people when they seize on the unconscious is, so like how powerful is it? So how do we count actions? And I'm going to lift this glass up right now. Is that all unconsciously motivated? I think that the number of actions, when we start to think, a lot of these actions aren't of any interest. So you're thinking of the interesting actions, a lot of them maybe seem unconsciously motivated. But there's a whole bunch of actions that we don't think of as terribly interesting. That's really much more routine and multitudinous. If we could even count these actions, that would be hard to do. That I think folk psychology does explain. So I don't have a problem. Well, I'll say two things. I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem ordinarily of incorporating unconscious motivations where it seems like there's something going on that is unconsciously motivated. But if I think in terms of why did a sizable portion of the United States vote for Trump? I'm not sure how much I would want to say, is there some unconscious elements there? Probably. But I think there's a lot of conscious elements there too, in terms of interests and how interests are perceived and things that people are conscious of. Are there things that they're not conscious of? Yeah.
So, I mean, just to address some of those, if I can remember them all. So, why do I like Decentered? I think for me, it comes back to the sort of critical realist account of causation. I think at the end of the day, and when we're talking about ontology, we're talking about a differentiated and stratified ontology. Now, stratification can mean all different things, and it's probably, in some respects, an unhelpful term because it makes it sound like there are particular individual strata or levels that, and it's just not that simple. So it's differentiated, it's stratified, and then we have this account of what George Steinmetz, I think, really helpfully clarifies with the four C's, where you have contingent, conjunctural, complex, causation. I would want to add another C, and that's changing, which I think makes sense. And so once we start to have this, we start to move into the territory of overdetermination, which of course came from Freud. When you're looking at dream content, the manifest and the latent is the sort of images that are formed in the dream are overdetermined by all sorts of experiences, associations, images, however you want to sort of characterize it. Unconscious drives trying to reconcile trauma, or so already the sort of that sort of decentering of the subject that Freud in part and Nietzsche as well started to unpick is unpicked along the lines of overdetermination, which I see is quite compatible with critical realism. And so I think assemblage theory is another in this sort of this tradition where we have different elements, linguistic, material, conceptual, bodies that are sort of coming together in that sort of complex, conjunctural, contingent, changing sort of fashion. So I think that's a helpful way of thinking through the social world. That often means, I think, that you have this sort of fused elements, where it's not easy to analytically tear apart some of these relations and categories. Now, I think the risk, and I've been talking to Dave Eldevas about this, is that the world just becomes assemblages, that everything's this rapidly changing contingent, sort of very post-structurally account. And I mean, I agree with him that there are actually features that are more stable, and more, in some respects, more traditional in terms of, well, or can be articulated by more traditional social theory, in sort of the sort of classic Marxian, Durkheimian, even maybe Weberian traditions. There are limits to what they can articulate, there are limits to what assemblage theory can articulate, and perhaps it is some sort of spectrum that exists between the two. And you know, it will be, as sociologists like to say, it will be an empirical question as to which sort of conceptual aspects that are drawn on, and to how far in either direction that you need to go in order to explain a particular phenomena. So I find that sort of, again, that sort of decentering helpful, in which perhaps the sort of centered or stable structures are more towards being well, a bit like the closed system, open system distinction in Roy's work, where the sort of classic conceptions of structured as sort of centered, naturalizing, consistent, are more of a peculiarity, at least in sort of the current conditions of modernity, than would otherwise be the case. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in terms of the emphasis upon difference, on heterogeneity, on change, I think this then feeds back into, say, let's keep going with the unconscious and the habitus, and I think this is one of the problems with the manner in which the habitus is articulated, is that it tends to present in very structuralist terms. In that phrase, that habitus is a structured structure functioning as a structuring structure. The key word in that is structure, and it's not always clear, as you said, what Bourdieu means by structure, but it often seems to lack that decentered, inconsistent, and heterogeneous quality. So when we talk about something like the weight of experience, I can be autobiographical as somebody who grew up in the middle of Australia and who at some point went to Canberra and studied at university, who worked in the IT field, who then found himself in London and then found himself at Yale. It's very sort of, in many respects, very fractured, very diffuse and very differentiated experiences, which somehow are all present and expressed in different ways at different times, and have this this tendency to express themselves in response to particular things. So actually, just before coming, I was looking at what books I was going to bring, and because I'm a bit of a Foucauldian, I sort of reached on the shelf to pick up The Order of Things and had a very, very visceral reaction to that, where all these emotions sort of flooded in, because during my PhD I was incredibly unhappy, and it was actually the moment that I bought The Order of Things at a bookstore, sat down and read it, that actually that crystallized at that moment a number of sort of things I'd been thinking and experiencing. And then to sort of pick the book off the shelf, then suddenly all these elements raced back. And and I think that's maybe a window into sometimes how the agent is in some respects decentered and perhaps even overdetermined, or perhaps I think Latour uses the term overrun, overcome or overtaken is the term he uses, overtaken by particular things, whether it's emotions, whether it's experiences, whether it's ways of doing things, particular routinized behavior. So that sort of decentering of the agent along these different lines, I think, allows for a more, at the end of the day, a more useful way of trying to articulate agency and the agent's relationship to structures and the things they encounter in the world. And critical realism, because it's got a good account of causation, because it has that sort of, that complex contingent conjunctural account of causation, is able to, I think, explain these things in a way that Bourdieu and Latour don't, for example, because they talk about mechanisms, they talk about causation, but that's about as far as they go. So for me, that's sort of the work that the decentering is doing.
So, again, have a more positive reaction than you might think.
Right.
So, but again, it would come back to a kind of a challenge.
Yep.
So when I hear you talk about the decentered subject and being overdetermined elements, it's kind of a before picture.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a problem with what you're saying. In fact, it makes a whole lot of sense that they're different currents. But as you say, they become fused. They become kind of centered. And then the subject has got to act on them as a fused kind of, you say, you have this kind of reaction to Foucault. And all these emotions come together and you decide, do I pick the book up or do I not pick the book up? Do I take this book or do I not take the book? Yeah, I'm feeling really good, but I don't really need the book and I got too much to carry, so I'm going to leave it home, or I can't go without Foucault. I mean, on one hand, however overdetermined and fused, they come together in a way that you make a decision on, and you make a discrete action.
In that situation, I make a discrete action.
Well, okay, but I'm saying that the fact that, so all these factors come together, they can be, that wouldn't be something that I'm denying necessarily. So, but it's still the subject that is ultimately deciding somehow, either articulating in his or her mind, or just less consciously, they come fused and the person acts, makes a decision, and something has to happen. So the subject is doing something. And I think it varies. You know, you might say, well, did you decide to take, why did you decide to leave the book at home? Why did you decide to take the book? And you say, well, I don't completely know. But you somewhat know. I mean, you've articulated some of these things. So it's like completely, I have no idea. Something compelled me to take the book. I mean, there are disparate feelings. So, and let me just say, so it seems to me I can accommodate some of what you're saying. And I could even say, yeah, what you described sounds like an assemblage. So fine, I can see assemblage being an apt term there, an assemblage of thoughts and feelings and experiences that's diffuse and don't have any really shape to it, and they get fused. I don't have a problem with that. But it seems to me that in your talk of fusion in that context, there is a centering going on that eventuates in some kind of action that the whole is taking. So I would say, as much as I'm giving to you, you ought to give some ground.
So can I just push on one thing?
Let me just say one more thing, because it won't take me that long.
No, that's fine.
Assemblage in other contexts versus mechanisms? Well, okay, yeah, maybe I'll take, you want to push me?
The question is, I mean, you talked about the decision, in some respects, the deciding subject. And again, this is where, for me, the sort of decentered aspect would come in that, well, let's flip it around in terms of the subject, who the subject is and how the subject decides and the basis on which they decide. So I have no problem saying that, you know, in certain situations, decisions are made, they're explicit. And, I mean, even when they're not explicit, there's a sense in which a decision is made at sort of deeper levels, one might say. So the question I think it raises is the deciding subject. And here I'm a little bit, this will shock you to no end, no doubt, I'm a little bit sympathetic to Althusser and the sort of notion of interpolation, and this is picked up in Foucault as well, that the subject is formed by certain social relations, by certain callings, however you want to put it. Althusser has the interpolation where the subject responds to the source of authority. And what's often, I think, missed, unfortunately, is one of the illustrations that he gives, which I think is the most useful. And this is of the religious convert, that there is something, you have the call to, you have the altar call, for whatever reason, experience, background, people respond to that, and in some respects in that, their subjectivity is formed, it's colonized, perhaps would be another way of putting it, and so they cease to be whatever it is, and they become a Christian, and they respond to things in a Christian way, and there's all these, there's texts, there's examples that they draw upon, and that starts to, that starts to form them, so that the very decision processes that they make are already colonized by these particular elements that are incorporated into that person's experience, into their life world, into whatever you want to call it. So again, this raises the question of, I think, how we understand decisions and the sort of relation between social processes and then the deciding agent, I suppose, would be the way to put it. And of course, this is where Foucault and other people would want to talk about the self, or the subject has been an effective discourse, because of that sort of process in which it's not simply that there's a pool of resources that are given to a subject, but they're almost they begin to act as a Christian in that sense, rather than. I don't know. I mean, I know you love Althusser as well.
I don't love Althusser, but actually, I don't have any problem whatsoever with your extrapolation of Althusser. I would just say, well, that's not really Althusser. I mean, well, it may be. I don't actually remember. It's been so long since I read Althusser, this example of the Christian. My objection to Althusser is, as a lot of people said, and to Foucault, is I don't have any problem whatsoever with what you described. It resonates with me because I am a Christian, and I do feel called, and if you want to say colonized, I don't know that I would necessarily say that, but I would say ordered. Definitely my life is ordered and structured, but does that make me some kind of a zombie that just follows structure? And as you know, I'm a very heterodox Catholic, so I don't just follow whatever comes down from the bishops. The present pope's okay. So it's I think what gets picked up by, let's not talk about Althusser and Foucault as such, but what gets picked up is the subject is just an effect, and of course the subject is socially produced, but there is a reality there. This goes back to there is a persistent reality there that is the subject, which is more than a social production. That it's a social production that is capable of reflection and weighing, and so I can weigh. I say, the Catholic Church teaches that homosexuality is a sin, versus what I think is a Christian response, and says, well, if people, people should be free to act on their deepest loving impulses. So I don't see a Foucauldian or Althusserian, they're not much help to me in explaining that behavior, because they see, just to say, look, I'm a function of, I don't know, heterogeneous discourses. Why? Well, why? You know, I think I would go back to some of the things you said, that sure, do I know why I'm cold in the ways that I feel cold? I can say that, you know, the Christian ethic, which I don't find practiced much in the United States by the Christians, of love and tolerance really grabs me. Why does it grab me? I don't know. I can't answer that. I mean, what is it about me? I say, well, am I just the type of person that's going to be grabbed by this kind of thing? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I can say, though, and I think it's right, that I persist in this direction because it does, in fact, grab me. Now, you can say, well, yeah, but there's all these dissented reasons why it grabs you. Maybe, I don't know. I just don't know. But that's why I say that they come to a fused emotional response to which I act on.
So can I take it just in a sort of related direction?
Yeah.
Just because we've discussed this as well, very, very briefly. But this is the question of human nature, which again it's a bit of a controversial issue within critical realism, although critical realists do tend towards, well, I think the vast majority of them do tend towards some sort of account, a need to defend an account of human nature, or some degree of humanism that goes along with that. Now, I know you're more on that side, and
you've, to my mind, conflated two different things.
Oh, good. What are the two things?
Human nature and humanism.
Okay, that's fair.
I mean, I would say, well, there's got to be human nature. I mean, here I'm essentialist in the sense, say, and Tony Lawson puts it right. There's got to be some properties in terms of which humans are different from things that are not human. Otherwise, we don't have a category. Why even talk about human? I have to know what you're talking about. So I would say, you know, what is human nature? Well, human nature. I mean, I think there's something that makes humans humans, if you want. But what is human nature? I don't know what human nature is. I mean, I think human nature, as Marx said, is very socially malleable. And I also think, and here I might be the extreme end of the humanists in saying that I think persons are a social emergent, and we become persons. We're not born persons. We're not persons in the fetus, which is a heterodox Catholic thing to say.
Yeah. I mean, we could go back to the question of identity and find the identity of a Catholic person, but we're not going to go into that. But I suppose the question about human nature is sort of a rough segue into, I mean, one of the reasons that we're both sitting here is because we're about to go to a conference on values and flourishing, and part of that has been this advocacy by people from across the board, a few critical realists as well, towards this idea of positive psychology, positive sociology, as a sort of investigation into the conditions under which human beings flourish, or is concerned with questions of human flourishing. I think we're more on the same page with this in many respects, but what's your take on this, and how do you see sort of critical realism in this sort of space?
So this is like a good case in point. I'm immersed in critical realist discourse. I'm also discoursed in Christian discourse. And on that basis, I have to weigh, and I have to evaluate, and I have to think. And so I've been among the critical realists. Well, maybe with you, I've been a lone voice against this whole flourishing direction, arguing that it still smacks to me of enlightened egoism and utilitarianism. And the theologian, Jennifer Hurt, who's going to comment on my paper, said almost exactly the same thing that I said. And she makes a distinction between, what should you call it? A welfare-oriented flourishing and excellence-oriented. And she says that, the people who want to talk about flourishing say you're flourishing only if you build in all these kinds of good qualities, that you're concerned for others and good relationships. Whereas she and I both would say, instead of being concerned about your own or even collective flourishing, we should be concerned about what's good and right in and of themselves because they're good and right. And once you pursue those things, well, then maybe you'll flourish. But that's not your motivation. The motivation shouldn't be, I don't, in the example I use, and she uses a very similar example. When the Good Samaritan sees the poor hapless victim on the road, he's not thinking in terms of flourishing, he's thinking in response to the other. He's not thinking about his own flourishing or what's good for flourishing collectively. He's just responding to the other person in need. And I think, so I'm not really on board with, I'm on board certainly with the moral direction, the larger moral direction infused into social sciences. I'm definitely on board with that, and I have written on this subject way before this was popular.
So, I mean, you would advocate for a sort of moral realism, that there are moral truths that are...
I do think there are moral truths, yeah.
And that they're independent of
culture.
Culture.
Yeah, I do, yeah. I think, but now here's, okay. I adhere to what's called situation ethics, which is not the same as relativism. So situation ethics is really opposed to what in a different context is called nominalism, like the Ten Commandments, some set of rules. Do this, don't do that. Instead, I think that what I adhere to, what I think are morally real, are certain abstract principles like love and justice. And whatever the loving and just thing is in a situation, that's what you should do, rather than follow some particular rules, which is how I arrive at being a proponent of gay marriage.
Right. I mean, and you know this, I come from the very sort of opposite end in terms of the sort of critical, the sort of critical anti-normative side of the debate. And I mean, in some respects, we're very united on the problematic, that human flourishing is problematic. But then, I mean, you go into that sort of moral realism side, and I go into the sort of anti-normative critical side. And so I'm setting up my position so that you can have yours say, and that's that again. Let's start this diffuse quality of the social world of human beings, of culture, of language, of everything that we've talked about, creates this space in which the imposition of particular forms of normative behavior is deeply problematic. And again, this is the sort of Foucault, the sort of technologies of the self, in which the self is cultivated and formed in particular directions for particular social reasons. And part of that is, of course, that certain goods or certain moral truths become a real, or they're realized, or they become real to that particular discourse. And so in one sense, and we can tie this back to the question of what's real, in one sense there is moral realism, but it's internal to particular normative traditions. I mean, how would you...
So I would throw this question back at you.
Sure.
So if you say you're an iconoclastic kind of guy, and you're always going to take the contrary position, not always.
No, I'm not.
Not always. Not always.
Yeah.
I don't mean that, but you're comfortable taking the. The reason I said that is, I mean, just because you find yourself in a normative tradition doesn't mean that you are going to accept. I'm talking about you specifically. You are going to accept it. So you must, and yet you're driven very passionately to take on these battles. There must be some moral calling that you're responding to that you don't see as just arbitrarily associated with some moral tradition that you're in.
Yes, that's probably true.
Okay.
I mean, we could get all psychoanalytic here, but let's
well,
not.
But if you go psychoanalytic, then you're really traducing it seems to me, then you're reducing your, what I think is a moral calling to just causal processes. I think that you're not being fair to yourself if you do that.
Okay, I mean, yeah, it's so. I mean, one of the things I've argued elsewhere is that, which you're going to have a shot at me about because you'll probably agree and then turn it against me, but that's fine. And that there's that part of realism is actually about doing justice, and this process of doing justice to reality. And I think this is what's driving me particularly towards the sort of question of the decentered aspects, that doing justice to reality actually involves accepting that sort of radically decentered nature and responding to that as the sort of that in some respects is justice, and then that sort of normative the sort of imposition of law collapses justice in that sense. It imposes a sort of normativity which...
What does?
The sort of imposition of a law or a norm or a rule or whatever.
But you're acting... I think... So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to turn it against you. I mean, I don't want to turn it entirely against you because I think there's something valuable that you're seeing. I guess this is my take. I think there's something valuable that you're seeing that calls you to this. But it seems to me, you like this because this is kind of Derrida. you set up a kind of a binary here.
Yeah.
And in some sense, I think you don't want to just say that your commitment to this justice is just some kind of crazy psychoanalytical effect of the assemblage behind the subject you are. Otherwise, why should I say, well, go see a psychiatrist. Don't. You got really nothing to say to me. You really have to say that this is something beyond. It may be all that, and yet even so, you're pressing some kind of, you want me to respond, and I do, to the moral call that you are issuing that's quite independent of how you may have arrived at it.
I think we should probably end it there before this becomes even more psychoanalytic.
Right.
Thanks, Doug. It's been really good.
You're welcome.
Just
I
to
enjoyed
nut
it
through
too.
these issues again.